Hey, Frankie, we're coming up on our 1 year anniversary of the PSI Effect podcast. And I know we've been talking about doing something special for that big event. I know I'm excited about it when I think about what it took for us to get everything off the ground. But hey, what do you think about that? What should we do?
I mean, it's amazing that it's been that long already. Seems like we just got started and we're almost at the 1 year mark. But I think it would be great if we could incorporate our listeners, people that have been impacted. I'd love to hear from
Ooh,
some
that's
of the
good.
people we've that's been impacted by the podcast in positive ways, and hear how they've been able to glean some good stuff from the podcast, and maybe even come on and join us as we get ready to celebrate the 50th episode.
That is fantastic. I like that idea. Well, y'all heard it. Frankie's just invited you to come on the podcast and share your experiences that you have had listening to us over the last year. So if you're interested in doing that, just drop us a DM on any of the social platforms where you find us, and we can reach out and see if we can get something set up and get you on this podcast and share with others like yourself and help others to find their way to positive experiences as well.
Yeah. And with that, enjoy the upcoming episode.
Setbacks are temporary, but comebacks, they are legendary. Welcome back to the PSI Effect, where we pause, shift, and ignite purpose that speaks louder than your past. This is Neug, and together with Frankie, we're your hosts in this space, and your comeback starts now.
Welcome back to the PSI Effect podcast. I am here with Frankie, and we're talking about independence and freedom. And so we're looking forward to having that conversation. But as always, before we jump into it, we got to touch base with Frankie and kind of see what's going on. I know you had some exciting things going on with you and your eldest.
Yeah. So last week I was talking about how it was the big transition, graduation celebrations, and all that other good stuff. Well, the transitions just keep on coming because this actually a couple of days ago, 2 days ago, and then yesterday, we were down at his new school for the official college freshman orientation. So,
Awesome.
yeah, that was a big deal because it was an overnight affair. I think it was great for him because it got him a little bit more acquainted with the space, and I think it did a lot to better enable him to see himself in that space for what he wants to accomplish. Like we talk about on the podcast, visualization is actually very important. So it's good to be able
Yeah.
to visualize where you're trying to go, where you're trying to get to when you're trying to rise. And I think that really clicked for him as we were there over the past couple of days. Made some new friends, got to stay in the dorm to see what that was
Hmm.
like. And the whole time too, we've been taking my youngest along with us as well. So he's been able to be there from the initial college visits through graduation, and now
Hmm.
seeing the whole process of what it looks like for orientation, just to make sure he feels like he's included too. But it's really exciting, and at the same time, for me, I'll be honest, I'll be vulnerable a little bit, unnerving, because that just really cemented it for me. It's like, oh man, he is about to be out of the house. He's about to be not easily accessible. It's not like I can just ride down the road just a little ways. He's a good distance away with this school. So it's definitely some adjustment for me, and it's going to be some adjustment for his mom too.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure. I am so sure about that. Well, that just kind of ties into what we're talking about today, Frankie, because we're talking about, independence and freedom. And so, your eldest will have just a taste of what independence and freedom, managing his day to day is all about. And so, when we think of independence and freedom, we think about the Declaration of Independence back in 1776 and how a group of folks got together and sat down and made some decisions about their current state of being, and how they wanted to get away from Great Britain and the hold that Great Britain had on them. And so, thus the Declaration of Independence was created, out of these conversations that they had about, the direction that they wanted their lives to go and the people that were, around at that point in time and what they wanted for them different from what they were getting from or what they were experiencing from the hold that England had on them. And so, as we talk about the Declaration of Independence, or as we talk about independence, we kind of frame this conversation around that type of understanding or that type of knowing of what you really want for your independence. And so that's kind of where we're going with this today. And, I was excited about the conversation as I was reading over our preparation for this episode. A lot of things came to surface that you just kind of take for granted sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. And we may mention to the founding of this country and the things that those people went through as they were drafting this document. But the thing that stood out to me the most is they weren't just complaining. They had taken account of the current state. Like, all right, where are we? And then they used that current state to envision what future state they wanted to be in. And I think that's key. And I think that's going to be kind of a running theme throughout our conversation today.
Absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head. They really sat down and gave it some thought. They really internalized where they were and where they wanted to be. And I agree with you. I think that is very important in as we move forward. And as we move forward, I do want to just give a quick definition. We talk about freedom and independence. And so I looked up definition of freedom just to make sure that I had everything the way I wanted to say it here today. And I noticed that there were so many different definitions out there
Hmm.
for freedom. And so I culminated, a lot of what I saw into this here. So freedom really is the power and the right to think, speak, and act without external hindrance, coercion, or constraint. And then the definition of independence, which again, there's a few definitions out there for independence. That being the state of being free of the control of some other person's country or entity. And so when we think about those two definitions in the conversation that we're having today, it just makes perfect sense of how, you think about your own life and your own sense of being and how you want to have control over your life and the decisions that you make.
Yeah, like we talk about with so many different things on the podcast, the idea of freedom and independence are very much in the eye of the beholder. There are lots of different flavors, and it all depends on the perspective with which somebody's coming to the table as to what freedom means to them, what independence means to them. Because what could feel like freedom to me could feel like oppression to somebody else.
Mhm.
Or, what feels like freedom to somebody else feels like, oppression to me. So it's very much a matter of perspective. And it depends on, that prickly pear that we like to call free will and what it is that drives us, what we're passionate about, what our dreams are. All of those things factor into what we consider our definition of freedom and independence.
Absolutely. And along with that, it's not lost on me how there may be some people who feel like they're in situations that they can't break free of. And so, it is a fine line when we talk about freedom and independence and, understanding that there are those who are, in situations where they feel trapped in that and in situations where they can't get out of. And, hopefully there are some of those folks that might be listening to us today and can pick up a few things that we're talking about and apply them and help them through possibly help them through some of the situations that they're in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, freedom can be conditional too, to a certain extent, depending on what season you are in your life, depending on what
Mhm.
situation you're navigating. You can feel that feeling of freedom could be fleeting, depending on what's going on in your world. So it not only is it a very broad definition for what those, freedom and independence actually mean, but I think it's also very fleeting at times as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And so, as we move forward here in this conversation, one of the things that made the drafters of the Declaration of Independence so powerful is that they weren't certain that they were going to succeed. They weren't certain that they were going to win, right?
Mm.
But they were certain that they couldn't stay in the current situation that they were in. So they had no idea whether this was going to be a successful endeavor or not. And I think that speaks to, how we approach independence and freedom. And sometimes, we have to make decisions that we're uncertain of, that we don't have full knowledge of whether or not it's going to be a successful situation for us.
I mean, that's a clear definition for me. And it tells me that freedom and independence aren't attainable without some level of risk
Of risk. Yeah.
and vulnerability.
Yeah.
If we're not willing to risk anything, how can we ever know that we truly are free?
Yeah. Absolutely. You just have to be clear that where you are is not working for you and you need to do something different. Right.
Hmm.
Um, and, I guess in a sense, you just have to own that position and move forward.
Yeah. And what do we do in this situation though when we feel like we're not empowered? We're talking about freedom and we're talking about feelings. Empowerment comes in there too. How do you think empowerment and feelings of empowerment factor in when we try to take ownership of those situations?
I think they really are kissing cousins because you have to have some level of self-confidence, self-empowerment in order to move forward. And if you don't, I think that you're stuck in that situation where independence is just out of your grasp.
Yeah. And I think there's some negative perception in there too that might stay people's hands or make them or detract from a feeling of empowerment, feeling of negative backlash, feeling of being judged harshly by others. Some of those things can be pretty powerful when it comes to staying our hand or staying in the current situation, saying, all right, well, I'm in this current state. I'll just keep enduring it rather than push against it to try to break free.
Yeah, and that you just described, some feelings of fear, right?
Mhm.
Because you're uncertain of what the future looks like. You're uncertain of where this decision is going to take you. And so that feeling of fear can hold you back as well. And I can imagine that that feeling of fear holds folks back in a lot of different situations. And I think it's timely that we put it out there with this conversation about independence and making that choice, but understanding that it may not work, but making a decision to move from where you are, where it's clearly not making you happy, not making you fulfilled, or not helping you be fulfilled, then stepping out, as they say, stepping out on faith,
Mhm.
and just believing in yourself and believing that you're making the right decision.
Yeah. Just that step or that decision, even if you don't know what the outcome is going to be, just that decision and first step is progress. And that's something that we have to keep in mind.
Yeah. So as we talk about the founders and writing this Declaration of Independence, they had to identify what it was that they felt was holding them back, right? How they felt oppressed by the king at that point. And so they had to sit down and be very specific about why it was that they wanted to have their independence. And I can only imagine how difficult that may have been, because it wasn't just one person trying to figure this out, right? It was a group of people. And
Hmm.
so when you have that, you get in a group think and all those other, possible scenarios that kind of hold you back. So, um, but they were very specific. They had to be very specific about what they wanted, where they were coming from, and where they wanted to go.
Yeah. I mean, that very much sounds like the type of thing that we do when we hit the pause in our PSI framework. We have to take that inventory. I know we sound like a broken record sometimes, but in that pause, we really have to take inventory of the current state, gather that data. What is going on in my current situation that I can't abide by anymore? What is it that I need to change?
Absolutely. And when you do that, we've said this before in other podcasts as well, is that you have to be honest about what you're considering. You have to be honest about yourself, and you have to be honest about, I guess, what you want. Um, and so that is a very key piece, is being honest about the decision that you want to make, or be honest about yourself and trying to identify the decision that you want to make to move forward. Um, so, as we were putting this together, so there's four key reasons, or four invisible chains. Man, I don't know why I'm so tongue tied today. There are four invisible chains that tend to hold people back, or can hold people back. And one of those chains is probably familiar to our audience, and that is the need for approval. So the need for approval, you may be controlled by approval when you constantly adjust yourself to keep others comfortable, right?
Mm.
Um, or you may hesitate to act until someone agrees with you. And I can imagine that that is a common trait, waiting until somebody agrees with you before you make a decision to move forward.
How do you think waiting how does that make things better? In the mind of somebody who might be in this invisible chain of wanting to or needing approval before they can move. If this invisible chain is holding them, what about getting approval or partnership from somebody else makes it easier?
Well, I think if you have an accountability partner, as we've mentioned, that's one thing. But if you're just standing back in fear, you want to make this decision, but you don't want to pull the trigger until somebody tells you it's okay. Um, I think that's the rub there is, having confidence, or having confidence and having faith in your decision that you can make this decision on your own and you're going to be okay. But I
Mm.
think holding back and waiting for somebody to just say, well, yeah, Nuge, I mean, that's a good idea, that's a good decision. I agree with you. I mean, I think as long as we continue to do that, or if we do that, more often than not, I think that we do ourselves a disservice, and that's what sometimes holds us back.
Yeah, and I think too that agreement or approval, the reason that this is such a slippery slope for this invisible chain in particular is that agreement or that approval absolves us from sole responsibility. It reduces our perception of the risk involved. So if I have some, off the wall idea or something and I run it by you and you say okay, then that means okay, I've got a partner in this and I'm not doing it by ourselves. And sometimes that seeking comfort of somebody else's approval is exactly what you said. It's going to hold us back. It's going to keep us from going in new directions, for going on paths that haven't been tread upon before. So it's really, I think this is one of the most, this need for approval is one of the most constraining chains that people have to deal with.
Yeah, and that's probably true because, when you make decisions that are outside of your norm, or if they stretch you, I think you do have a little bit of a feeling that there's, some risk involved. And I think that fear of that risk, that fear of that, outcome not being what you want is what, pushes you to that idea that you need somebody's approval in order to move forward, right?
Mm.
So excuse me. And I think that people probably stay in careers longer than they would like to for some of that reason. Because they want someone to validate the fact that, they're thinking that this position that they're in is not necessarily the right position for them. Um, and that could be a bit overwhelming. I know I had that situation in my own life when I started off. Being in a position that wasn't exactly right. I could feel that there was something that was not exactly right with what I was, not necessarily with what I was doing, but that the situation or the organization at that time um, was just not the ideal spot for me. So grappling with that is can be a challenge.
Yeah. I mean, I was in the same boat. I was in the same boat, feeling like, okay, I just need to stick this thing out. I try to get the approval that I wanted. Like, all right, let me talk about this with some coworkers. Let me see if some of them think that I should leave as well. Or let me talk about this with family members, see if they think I should leave. And, not having those conversations and not getting that approval, I just stayed stuck. So I've been held down by that chain, that need for approval. So yeah, let's get rid of that.
Absolutely. So let's move on to the chain of past identity and how our past identity can make us believe that that's who we are, right?
Mm.
Make us believe that that's our current identity. Um, And, things like relationships, right? Relationships never work out for me. You've had some relationships that failed in the past, but you hold on to that identity because you feel like, you're never going to have a good relationship because you've failed at relationships in the past. Never mind the fact that, as the saying goes, it takes two to tango, right? So you may not have
Mhm.
been the sole issue or the sole problem in that relationship, but you take on that identity because you've had a few relationships in the past that didn't work out for you.
Yeah, the past is a great learning tool, and people tend to hold it up as if it is a mirror of your current state.
Mm.
It's the past. It's behind you. Ray Lewis said this. I don't know the context in which he said it, but he said it during a commercial. He said, "Only a fool trips over what's behind him,"
Mm.
because the notion is that we should be moving forward, and if we're moving forward, how are you going to trip over something behind you unless you stop making progress and going in the opposite direction? So when we fall victim to this chain of this past identity of what's happened in the past, we're letting something pull us backwards. We're letting something keep us rooted where we are. And that's not going to get us to where we need to be. That's just going to create that downward spiral, draw us closer to rock bottom, like we've talked about in
Yeah.
the past.
Well, let's move on to the fear disguised as wisdom.
Mm.
Like fear doesn't always tell you don't do it. Um, but sometimes it seems like a reasonable thing, right? Um, wait until you know more. Wait until you know more about the situation, or wait until you have a better understanding of this new position that you want to grow into, or wait until you have dated this person for a while before you uh, want to open up and let that person in. I mean, there's a lot of fear out
Hmm.
there, and it's based on history. It's based on your history. It's based on what you feel like you've learned in the past, right? And you're just trying to protect yourself, and there's a degree of caution there. And I'm not saying that you should automatically let go of that caution, but recognizing that that type of fear is interfering with your identity, interfering with you reaching the level of independence that you want, could be problematic.
It is problematic. There's no could be about it. Fear disguised as wisdom, that's, talking about the disguise, that's a wolf in sheep's clothing, because what it really is loss aversion. We are afraid of loss or feeling like there's some sort of negative outcome. And that fear is one of the most powerful things that hold us in place, that hold us captive. And we think about fear disguised as wisdom. What's really happening is that, part of our brain is firing. We talked about it in, some of our habit episodes in the past. We've got our, fast part of our brain where emotions and all that other stuff live. So we feel the fear, and then that fake wisdom comes in and tries to rationalize that fear. And that's where that fear disguised as wisdom comes from. So we have an intense emotion, and then we try to rationalize that emotion to lower the intensity. Now, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing when it comes to all of the different spectrums of emotions that we could experience as people. But in this particular case, we've just got to make sure that we're not diluting the messaging to the point where it's causing us to stay stuck, to stay in our captive state.
And in a sense, that fear is a survival mechanism for us.
Hmm.
We turn it on, and I think that all too often we leave it on a whole lot longer than it needs to be on. Um, And, sometimes we're in a situation where I think we just can't seem to turn it off. And so when we're talking about survival, we talk about those behaviors that we've performed in the past that, helped us in some way.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think this one is closely related to the past identity because it's something that's happened in the past and we haven't been able to let go of it. We've put up some sort of defensive mechanism, some sort of defensive barrier, and we just don't want to let it down. Like I can speak to this from the perspective of a parent, right?
Uh,
As a parent, all right, I saw, kid was running around the house and they bumped into the corner of a coffee table, right? Corner of a coffee table, got a good bruise. got a little cut, all that other good stuff. So my response, what do? I put those little cushions on all the corners in all the places,
Hmm.
right? Fast forward, my oldest is now 18. My youngest is 12. Guess what? Those little cushions are still, I'm looking at one of them right now, still on the corners, still in the corners, right? And that while that may be a bit of a wild example, I think it encapsulates what's happening in our minds is that something bad happened and we had to put up a defense mechanism or do something to cope with that bad thing happening. And even though the threat may be gone, we're holding on or staying in our defensive posture. And in that defensive posture, we can't make forward progress.
And so that survival identity, those fears, those fears keep us from really experiencing the peace that we want in our life or the peace that we're looking for in our life. They can keep us from, intimacy that we want in our life, keep us from growth and opportunity and some of those kinds of things. And, so what helped us survive at one point in our life may not necessarily be what's going to help us, reach the level of independence and freedom and success that we really want. And so, we just have to look at what is the cost of holding on or allowing those chains to hold us back. What is that costing us? How it's keeping us from our independence.
Yeah, the survival thing. Just one more thing about the survival. We think about survival. At least I think about fight or flight. We get into our fight or flight mode. And when we get into fight or flight mode, the rational part of our brains is deprioritized. It's I won't say it's shut down, but it's definitely deprioritized. So if we stay in this survival state for long periods of time, we're not really rationally approaching the problem that we're trying to deal with.
Yeah, and I think in that situation, that's one of those situations where I think, seeking some outside counsel, because I can imagine that there are folks who are afraid of a lot of different things, a great many things, and just may not know how to turn that fear off. And so, may need some outside help, outside counsel to help them get through that phase of where they are. So I just want to put that out there to our audience to make sure that you are taking good care of yourself, and if you need that outside help, certainly seek it, because being in fear is just I think about, you talk about your kids and bump their heads, and you can think about growing up and different things that scared you, and if you held on to that most of your life or all of your life, I can just imagine how that can really keep you from enjoying some of the things that you would really like to enjoy. But as I said, I understand that that it's real. Fear is real, and you can't tell people who are afraid of cats. You can't tell them there's nothing to be afraid of. They're afraid of cats. Right?
Right.
So, um, it's just a real thing. So as we continue on, we're going to talk a little bit about you know how to obtain this freedom, this independence that we're talking about. And part of that freedom, or gaining that freedom, requires replacing something else, right? Um, and so we talked about the founding fathers and drafting the Declaration of Independence. They knew what they didn't want. They knew they wanted to break away from the chains that England had on them, and so they had to figure out what they wanted to replace that with.
So I'm going to put on my science nerd hat for a little bit. In nature does not like a vacuum. About to get really nerdy here. That's the whole reason why airplanes can fly, is because of the shape of the wing. Air has to move faster over the top of it so that a vacuum isn't created, and that creates the lift and all that other stuff. So nature doesn't like a vacuum. If there's empty space, nature is going to do everything that it can to fill that empty space in. So if we've identified something that we no longer want in our lives, if we're going to try to take that out, we got to make sure that we put something into that space, because otherwise something else is going to expand into it, backfill into it. And if we're not intentional about what we choose, it may not result in the type of change that we're looking for.
And that's what the founders did, right? they declared that they wanted to build a better mousetrap than the one that they were running from. Um, and I think that to your point, if you skip that, then that is what really causes a problem because, like you said, if the airplane and I'm not a nerd, I'm not sciencey like that, but if the if the airplane runs into this vacuum, the folks on the plane probably aren't gonna be happy.
Oh, absolutely.
Uh, so that's what they did. So, some of the transitions that we need to think about as we look toward our independence is, move from approval to self trust, right? So
Hmm.
you move from having someone approve your decisions to trusting yourself to make those decisions on your own. So instead of needing everyone to understand your decision, you chose that decision and you understand why you're making that decision and you have trust in yourself and you believe in yourself, that you're not going to make a mistake regardless of if it turns out that um, it didn't turn out the way that you exactly wanted it. You believe in yourself that you are making the best decision for you.
Yeah, and that can be daunting though. If I'm been someone who has sought approval and needed approval from somebody else to move forward, that can seem kind of daunting. And I would encourage if you're in that same boat, think about some of the things that we've talked about in previous episodes. Break it down into smaller pieces. Don't try to make huge, all-encompassing decisions all at one time. Get some reps in on smaller scale things just to get those muscles flexing and firing in that mode. Make it visible. Talk about it. Talk about the decision you made with somebody rather than a decision that you're thinking about, trying to seek that approval. Tell them what you did versus what you think you're going to do. And then lastly, just remember that mistakes and failure are going to happen, and they're not condemnation of who you are or who we are. They're data points. So just try to remember that. If we make a decision, we move into this self-trust mode and we make this decision, sometimes it's going to be the wrong one. And that's okay. That just better informs us the next time. It is not a fatal blow.
Absolutely not. And as you mentioned, small steps. Promise yourself that you are going to do XYZ and stick to that, right? And I think that that's part of what you're saying is, take it and break it up into smaller pieces. But, you have to have some self accountability too, I think, in
Absolutely.
order to move forward. And then there's, moving from fear to courage. And so we've talked a lot about fear already. But moving from fear to courage, I mean, that can be a wide gap to cross. I mean, that's like, maybe trying to cross the Mississippi in one step, and I don't think you're going to do that.
Right.
Um, courage is definitely the absence of fear, but getting to that point of courage can take some work.
I will have to say I do disagree a little bit. I don't think that the courage is necessarily the absence of fear. I'm going to make one of my TV references like I am notorious for. There's a cartoon back in the day called Courage the Cowardly Dog. And it was about this little dog that had to face all this, crazy stuff to keep its owner safe. And he was terrified of everything. But yet and still, he did what he needed to do to protect his owners and the people that he cared about. And, the reason I bring up that comparison, I think that courage isn't the absence of fear. I think it is still doing what you need to do in spite of
In spite
being
of the
afraid,
fear.
in spite of the fear, in spite of being afraid. It's okay to be afraid. Just don't let it paralyze you. So, Nuge, another thing that we're going to have to think about, or a transition that we'll have to make as we're, replacing the thing that we said we don't want anymore. We have to think about making the transition from comparison to alignment. And we've kind of talked about this a little bit before, where we talked about, what's your standard? What are you comparing yourself to? What is the image that you're looking at or think that you're looking at when you're looking in the mirror, and really figuring out, okay, instead of trying to keep up with the Joneses per se, maybe I just need to focus a little bit more on making sure what I'm doing is in alignment with my goals, not what somebody else is doing.
Agree. That alignment to me, it's about aligning with who you are, right? Who are you?
Mhm.
And, is this thing that you're working toward or this thing that you're thinking of doing, this independence that you're seeking, is it a good fit for who you are? Because I think you can chase after some independence that, may not fit well with you as an individual. It may not fit well with your identity. And so having that alignment, I think is really important. And, as you said, not looking at what others are doing or what others are saying or others, timeline for your success, um, and looking at your own, alignment of who you are, I think is really where the success is going to come for you.
And at the same token of what you were just saying, thinking about comparing to what other people think or what other people suggest for you, another transition that we're going to have to deal with is dealing with something that people may have done to you. And that's a transition from resentment to responsibility, right? People are going to hurt us along the way. Things are going to happen. Things are not going to go according to plan. And sometimes that's because of something that somebody else did. We've talked about this and talked about the negativity involved if we hold a grudge and how that can just eat away at us. And rest assured, a grudge is a chain that's going to hold us in place and impede our ability to be independent and to be free. So we have to make sure as we make that transition from resentment to responsibility, we're not necessarily excusing what happened, but we're making sure that we understand we have ownership of what happens next. Yes, this thing happened in the past. This person may have wronged me or done me dirty, as folks like to say. But how I choose to react to that, whether I choose to carry that forward with me like a bag of bricks to slow my progress, that decision is mine to make, and I can be responsible for that.
That's right. You got to own it. You got to own it. And all of the consequence that comes with that if you decide to
Ooh,
hold on to that grudge.
consequences. Ooh, you said the C word.
The C word, consequences. Yeah. All right. So, and so then we get into moving into intentional living, right?
Mhm,
Um, so you move from survival mode into intentional living, and we talked about survival and fight or flight, and we've talked
mhm.
about fear, and we talked about courage, and so how does that play into moving out of survival and into the intentional living space?
I equate survival mode to the comfort zone. We've
Mm,
talked about the comfort zone before, where it's like, okay, I'm familiar with this. I feel safe here, right? You're in survival mode. I've got my force field up. I've got, shields up, Captain. I'm encased. I'm ready to, go into battle and feel safe about it. But just like the comfort zone, that survival mode over time becomes a prison. And we've got to break out of that prison because, growth can't happen there if we're in survival mode. So we have to be intentional with like, okay, I might, if I want to see what's happening outside, I'm going to have to open up this window. I can't keep the house sealed up. So we're going to have to open up a little bit and be intentional about what we're doing if we want to make that change, if we want to gain that freedom.
yeah, I think you have to know and you have to be intentional about who you want to become,
Mhm.
right? Who do you want to be? And you have to be intentional about your time and your energy. Like, who deserves my time or what deserves my time and my energy? And where do I want to spend that?
Mm.
Because you have to protect yourself when you're on this self improvement, journey. You have to protect your time, your energy. And it sounds like you have to be a bit selfish. And I think when it comes down to, who do you want to be and owning who you want to be, sometimes you do have to be a little bit selfish with those things.
Yeah. I don't know. Selfish has such a negative connotation. You just,
It does. It does. It really does. And I don't want folks to feel negativity.
Mhm.
Um, but you do have to. I don't know. I don't want to take away from what you were going to say, but you do have to be cognizant of where you're expending your energy if you really want to become something that you weren't before.
Yeah, I mean, our energy is kind of like our finances. If we blow it over here on, all this junk that's not moving the ball forward when we really need it for something important, we're not going to have any money there. So we have to be really good stewards of our energy.
Yeah. And we also have to make sure that we're not putting ourselves on an island. We talked about the
Mm,
village in the past. Just because you're on this journey of discovering your independence doesn't mean that you have to necessarily do it without the help and support and just, companionship of others.
yeah, I mean, isolation can be brutally destructive. If you create this echo chamber, if it's just you and you alone with your thoughts, I mean, there's a reason that isolation is used as a form of torture. It breaks the mind. So living in isolation is definitely not what we're encouraging people to do, because isolation and independence are not equal. We still need our village. We still need to be part of the wolf pack, or, whatever analogy you want to use, because we are not designed to be in isolation.
So now we come to the whole action part of the ignition part of our episode. And so when we think about the founding fathers and when we think about the founding fathers and drafting the Declaration of Independence, y'all notice how I slowed down there because I was talking really fast and my tongue was just tying me all up.
It happens.
But what they did was they wrote it down. So they didn't just they didn't just have a conversation. They didn't have just empty words about what they wanted to do, right? So they had this conversation, formulated this plan, and then they wrote it down. And not only did they write it down, they signed it.
Mhm.
And then not only did they sign it, I mean, they took that ownership. That signing of a document is ownership, right? But then they acted on it. And so I think that, that's kind of where we are. So we talked about these aspects of identity and fear and courage and all of these things that go into independence. I think that we have to identify what we want for
Mhm.
ourselves as independence, writing it down, right? You can sign it, put your initials on it, something. But I think writing it down as an individual says a lot. And then make sure that you take action on it. Because if you just write it down, it's just going to sit at the corner of your desk or sit in your journal, and it's just going to be there if you don't apply some action to it. What do you think,
Yeah,
Frankie?
I agree. And, for our listeners to be able to better action what we're talking about here, I mean, I think we can give, for quote unquote, a recipe for how you could draft your own Declaration of Independence, your personal Declaration of Independence. And the first step is you got to figure out, what is it that you got to find your freedom from? What are you declaring your freedom from? What is it in your current state that's got to change? Got to be specific, not just a bunch of feelings and negativity, but be very specific. What is the thing that is causing you the trouble that you have to move away from to find your freedom? So step one, name what you are declaring the freedom from.
And then, of course, you have to identify what it has cost you.
All right, that's step
And so
two.
this thing that you're moving away from, yeah, step two is naming what it has cost you. What opportunities have you avoided? What relationships have you avoided? What conversations have you not had? So you have to identify what it has cost you and be specific about that as well. Um, and be honest about, how you're determining that cost, right? Make sure that you understand the full weight of that cost. Make sure you understand the full weight of what non-action is costing you.
Yeah, it is not a null factor, that is for sure, because just because you're still doesn't mean it's not costing you anything. Wholeheartedly agree. And then step three, like we talked about, nature doesn't like a vacuum. We have to be very intentional. We have to decide, what are we choosing instead? We identified this thing in step one that we need to declare our freedom from. So in step three, that's where we intentionally describe, what are we choosing instead?
And then finally, it was step four. What is your one immediate action? So you got to take action. Attach your declaration to this action, right? So I think we can all agree that declaration or, a declaration without action isn't really going to get us anywhere. It's more like inspiration, right? It just
Hmm.
kind of fades to black, as they say. And that's evident of the Declaration of Independence is still around today, all after all these years, right? It's still here today. And so and there's action being taken on it. Some would agree or disagree with some of that action that is being taken at this point in time. However, the key factor here is, you're going to make this declaration. Then what are you going to do, right? Make that phone call to that person that you need to have that conversation with, right? Submit that application for that new position that you really want, right? Set a boundary. Um, if you think that your time and your energy is being abused,
Hmm.
right?
Don't talk
You're
about it.
free.
Be about it.
That's right. Absolutely. Be about it. That's
Hmm.
that's exactly right. You should put that on a t-shirt, Frankie.
I think somebody's already got that one, dude. So
But
with this recipe that we've been able to whip up, these 4 steps that we just reviewed, just to go back through them really quick. So, step 1, name what you're declaring your freedom from. Step 2, name what has that thing cost you. Step 3, decide what you're choosing instead. And step 4, take action. That's the recipe for our personal declaration of independence. So, Nuge, what kind of challenge you got for our audience this week?
well, the challenge is sit down and identify what your independence move is going to be, right? What is something that you want to move away from, something that may be keeping you from, advancing your career, or something that may be keeping you from having that fulfillment in that relationship. Whatever it looks like for you, identify what it is that you want to move from, and then sit down and decide what it is that um, you want to replace that with, right? You got to understand where you want to move from, and then understand where you want to move to, and then implement the 4 steps that we talked about. Um, you've already decided what you want to move from. You understand what it's cost you. You do that inventory, and then what you are going to replace it with, and then take your action. Right? Those are the steps that Frankie laid out eloquently. But your challenge is to actually put those 4 steps into practice. The first thing is identifying something in your life that you need to move away from, and then apply the steps in order to help you move to your end goal. And don't forget about the transitional steps that we talked about. Moving from approval to self trust, and moving from fear to courage, and so forth. Don't forget about those, because I think that that's going to be important as you determine what you want to move from, and as you determine what it has currently cost you in your life, and that cost is probably directly tied to why you want to move from that in the first place.
Hmm. 100%. I think that's a pretty tall challenge, but I think our audience is up to it. We've all got something that we need to declare our independence from. Somebody might say, well, I don't have anything that's binding me. I don't have anything holding me back. Well, just remember, we don't realize that we are missing our freedom if we're not moving, right? We don't feel the things that are tugging us or restraining us if we're sedentary and we're sitting still. So if you think something's not binding you, try moving in a new direction. There might be an invisible chain that you didn't realize holding you in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You don't have to wait for permission to become free, but you got to make the choice. You got to make the choice if that's what you want. And then you have to act like it's really what you want.
Hmm.
Right. And I think that that's what those steps identify. I think that that's what this conversation has been about. And, I'll just tell you, Frankie, this conversation opened my eyes as we were preparing for it, just kind of opened my eyes to, how, how we don't necessarily put a lot of thought in our independence. Right. We feel like we are independent. We feel like we are, have certain freedoms. But, when you really break it down, when you really take that inventory, I think you'll find that there's some pockets of what's happening in your life where you don't have the independence that you really want.
Yeah, everybody's got blind spots. We've all
Yeah.
got blinders on somewhere. I mean, you look at the authors of the Declaration of Independence. They had blind spots. They're very quick to call out the oppression that they were experiencing, but they didn't take into account some of the oppression they may have been executing as well, right? That's just the history of the matter.
Mhm.
But we've all got blind spots. And as we're trying to make this declaration of our personal independence, we've got to really engage in the pause to try to root out those blind spots where some of those invisible chains may be hiding.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know about you, Frankie, but I think this has been a good conversation. As always, I really appreciate spending this time with you and sharing with our audience. It's always very meaningful to
Oh,
me,
yeah.
and I do hope that we have shared some things that the audience will grab hold of and be able to use. Before we sign off here, thank you to our audience who have been listening to us. We really appreciate it. We thank you for your comments, your likes, and your subscriptions to our channels. We really do appreciate that. And with that, Frankie, I will let you tell our wonderful audience where they can find us in all of their social spaces.
Yes, indeed. So for everything PSI Effect podcast related, you could go to our website. This is psipod.com. And there you'll find links to all of our social media spaces. But more importantly, you'll find links to all the different places where you can subscribe to the audio version of our podcast. All those podcast aggregators like Amazon, Apple, Spotify, all those. Find your favorite podcast platform, subscribe today. You can also interact with us on YouTube. We post video of all of our episodes. You can search for the PSI Effect podcast or use our handle at This Is PSI Pod to find us on YouTube. That also works for TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. Hit us up in the social media spaces. We love interacting with you out there.
Okay, Frankie, thank you for that. I'm sure there's a lot of folks who really wanted to hear where they can find us, and we really appreciate that. And I just want to remind everybody until next time, remember that setbacks are temporary and comebacks are indeed legendary. And until next time, go out there and be brave and rise on purpose.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the PSI Effect podcast. This show doesn't happen without you, and you can connect with us via Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. Visit our website at thisispsipod.com and find us on YouTube and social media at This Is PSI Pod. That's at This Is PSI Pod. Until next time, remember, be brave and rise on purpose.